There is comfort in the familiar, a gentle reassurance that comes from knowing what tomorrow will bring. The world outside may be unpredictable, but within the boundaries of routine, we find a sense of peace. There's a rhythm to the mundane that lulls us into security, a quiet melody that plays in the background of our lives, soothing and constant. Meet Arthur Penwright, a man of habits whose life ticks with predictable grace. For Arthur, each day is a carefully composed sequence, a dance of small rituals that bring order to the chaos outside. Each day, he wakes at 6:30, brews his coffee just the way he likes it, and sits at the kitchen table to read the morning paper. The aroma of coffee fills the air, mingling with the soft light of dawn. At precisely 8, he leaves for work, his footsteps echoing on the quiet sidewalk. Evenings are quiet, dinner prepared with care, a favorite television show, and then bed, always at the same hour. His modest house is a sanctuary of order where everything has its place and nothing is left to chance. The cushions are always straight, the books aligned, the kitchen spotless. Arthur takes pride in his routine, believing it shields him from the world's chaos. In these small acts, he finds meaning and a sense of control, a buffer against uncertainty. But comfort is fragile, a thin curtain over the unknown, easily disturbed by the faintest breeze. Even the most carefully constructed routines can be disrupted. Tonight, that curtain will shift, and the familiar will give way to something unexpected. The metronome of Arthur's life is about to skip a beat, and the comfort of routine will be tested in ways he never imagined. The first sign was almost nothing, a tiny crack in the kitchen window, so faint it could have been missed entirely. The morning sun caught it just right, glinting off the jagged lines like a warning whispered in glass. Arthur paused, frowning, his mind racing to remember if he'd seen it before. He was sure it hadn't been there yesterday, but perhaps he was mistaken. Maybe it was just the house settling, or a stray pebble from the garden. Still, the sight of it unsettled him, a small imperfection in the familiar comfort of his home. Arthur leaned in, searching for a logical explanation. He ran his finger gently along the crack, half expecting it to vanish under his touch. But it remained, stubborn and real, a silent question mark in the glass. He tried to shrug it off, telling himself it was nothing, but the thought lingered in the back of his mind. He dismissed it, but unease lingered, curling around his thoughts like a shadow. The house, usually a place of comfort, suddenly felt different, less certain, less safe. That night, as he prepared for bed, another oddity caught his attention. His toothbrush was damp, though he always left it dry after use. He stared at it, puzzled, replaying his evening routine in his mind. He tried to rationalize, a splash from the faucet perhaps, or maybe he'd forgotten and rinsed it without thinking. But doubt crept in, persistent and cold, making him question his own memory. Lying in bed, every sound in the house felt sinister. The familiar creaks and groans of the old building seemed louder, more deliberate, as if the house itself was trying to tell him something. The hum of the fridge, the restless wind rattling the windows, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Tonight, these ordinary noises unsettled him, each one feeding his growing sense of unease. The fortress of his routine felt breached, as if invisible hands had reached in and disturbed the order he relied on. A crack in the glass, a damp toothbrush, small things, almost laughable on their own. But together, they were enough to let fear slip quietly into the spaces between his thoughts, unsettling the peace he once took for granted. Arthur's sanctuary no longer felt safe. The familiar walls seemed to close in, and he wondered what other small disturbances might be waiting for him in the shadows. The next day, Arthur's routine faltered. His mind replayed the oddities. He searched his home, desperate for proof that nothing was amiss. Everything seemed in order, but paranoia lingered. That evening he set a test. He turned a porcelain figurine to face the wall. If it moved overnight, he'd know he wasn't alone. He slept fitfully, waking before dawn. Creeping downstairs, he found the figurine turned back, and beside it, his damp toothbrush. The message was clear. Someone or something was in his home. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. Arthur's fear became certainty. Panic seized Arthur. This was no longer a coincidence. He grabbed his phone, called the police, and armed himself with a skillet. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound was a threat. Minutes crawled by until sirens wailed outside. Officers arrived, calm but alert. Arthur explained, the toothbrush, the figurine, the feeling of being watched. He led them inside, desperate for validation. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. He waited, trembling for the truth to be revealed. The monster, he hoped, would finally be found. The officers moved methodically, searching every room, their flashlights cutting through the thick shadows, illuminating corners that hadn't seen light in years. The old house creaked under their boots, every sound amplified by the silence that pressed in from all sides. They checked closets, peered under beds, and opened every cupboard but found nothing out of place. There was no forced entry, no sign of an intruder. The locks were untouched, the windows unbroken, and the entryway undisturbed, as if the house itself was holding its breath, hiding its secrets. But in the attic, tucked away beneath the slanted roof and layers of dust, they found a sleeping bag. Evidence that someone had been living there, hidden from sight. Scattered food wrappers littered the floor, and beside them, a diary. Its pages worn and filled with hurried handwriting, chronicling days and nights spent in secret. "Are you sure you live alone?" an officer asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Arthur, pale and trembling, insisted he did, his eyes darting nervously around the room, searching for answers he couldn't find. The officer flipped through the diary, reading aloud entries that detailed everything. Moving the figurine, the toothbrush, the smallest changes in the house that Arthur had noticed but couldn't explain. Even the crack in the attic window was mentioned, described in careful detail as if the writer was obsessed with every imperfection. "You've been writing this every night," the officer said gently, his words hanging in the air. Arthur stared at him, realization slowly dawning on his face. There was no stranger, only himself. The fortress he'd built to keep the world out was real, but so was the prisoner. Arthur was both the warden and the captive, trapped by his own mind in a house full of shadows. He looked in the mirror and saw not one reflection, but two. A fractured image of himself, split between reality and illusion, haunted by the person he'd become. The call was coming from inside the house. It always had been. A silent cry echoing through empty rooms, a secret only the walls had known until now.